Hello, this is the last presentation of this series, and in this we're going to talk about how is the significance of the impacts determined, and then some characteristics that the mitigations need to also consider, and then how the impacts should be managed. The purpose of our session is to explain the steps of the impact assessment process and discuss what are the impacts and benefits that might result from small hydropower projects. So the determination of significance, once we have, for instance, quantified the impacts that will happen, it consists in applying specific criteria to decide which of those impacts or benefits are more significant. So that means more serious and need to be considered to decide whether the project is approved or not. But different factors might influence the significance. For example, it will not be the same to put a small hydropower project in one river that is already transformed in comparison to one river that is not that transformed and that still has much of its native diversity and flows. Uh, when there are some changes, for example, already in decrease of species, especially aquatic species, or in other aspects like water quality, if the project is going to contribute any of those thresholds, then it could be considered significant. Mhm. So also significance might vary when we assess it at local level or when we zoom out to a more regional level. So local impacts will be less evident, but that doesn't mean that they are not as significant. Also, when we have, for instance, river systems with species that are endangered or rare, their presence increases the significance of any negative impacts. And so one step of the assessment process is to propose mitigations for those impacts that are identified. If we have significant impacts, how effective the mitigations are to control them is also something that can influence the determination of the significance. So for determining this significance or relative importance of the impacts or benefits, we consider two aspects. One is the impact itself, its characteristics, but the other is the importance or the acceptability uh, that people give to those impacts. And that might vary from one population or group or country to another. So the determination of significance is influenced by the values that people put on the impacts, the components that might be affected, or the benefits that will be obtained from the project. So the criteria that are also commonly used to determine significance are the magnitude of the impact, that is how severely it affects ecological processes, the duration, the reversibility, the probability of likelihood that it will occur, in which season that impact might happen. And remember, for instance, when we are talking about uh, events or biological processes that happen in a specific season, and the frequency of the impact, how often it occurs in a certain time, and then together with that, I'll come back up on this diagram to the duration, whether the impacts will be short-term or long-term. For the other values, let's say these first are more like technical criteria for determining significance. The more social criteria to determine significance refer to, for instance, how interested the public is on getting the benefits of the project or on protecting those components or species, for example, or forests or rivers that could be affected. And that goes together with whether there is already a designation for a particular area where the project could be implemented. For instance, it could be different if it is within a national park or if it is outside of a national park, or if there are species that are already listed as endangered or species that are considered common and not in danger. Mm. Uh, so there are different factors that are considered and need to be integrated in the decision of how significant the impacts are. And also, this is one area where there is no a standard universally adopted. But the criteria are mostly followed. So in most cases, in most countries, you will see that these are the criteria that are used to determine the significance. Sometimes there are less, sometimes they are combined, and sometimes there are others that might be included. But when we are talking first about the direction, for example, we are talking whether this effect of the project is positive, which would be a benefit, or is negative, which could mean is an impact. But also there is a possibility that there will be no effect on a particular component, and then it could be neutral. The regional extent, sometimes called the scope, refers to those boundaries that I mentioned before. So how far from the project footprint is the impact going to be experienced? Is it going to be local? Uh, is it going to be experienced within a radius of a few kilometers? Or is something that might affect a whole region or sub-basin? So typically, the larger the area is affected, the more significant the impact is. But I want to mention again that that does not exclude that there might be some local impacts that might be very significant. And that includes, for instance, impacts on cultural values or spiritual values that communities might have um, on the way they perceive some tangible or intangible parts of the environment. The duration refers to how long that particular impact could be experienced. Short-term impacts will occur only within a few days. They will last only a few days or maybe a few weeks. And then the environment has the capacity to recover. Medium-term impacts might take longer, and here these values for years are again not standard. In some cases, short-term might be months or no more than 1 year, and medium-term might be sometimes 5 years, in other cases 10 years, and long-term are effects that will last for longer time. For instance, if we are putting more sediment on the water because we are digging a canal to divert water, as long as the digging stops, the sediment will start to settle, and we don't expect many impacts after that, except if the amount of sediment was very large. But if we are talking about, for instance, removing part of the forest to open roads, to clear area, to build the particular hydropower plant or the project, then we might be talking about effects that might last like 20 years, 25 years, or even more, depending on the time that that forest will take to recover. There could be also another criteria that sometimes is called permanency related to this duration, and that means when the change is going to be permanent. So there is no chance that the system could recover. For instance, a simple example, if we are going to completely remove a forest and put parking lots and build uh, certain infrastructure, the forest will not come back to that area. And frequency refers to how often an impact is experienced within a certain period, and that depends on the type of the impact. For instance, noise could be how many hours per day there could be noise and how often it occurs. For instance, it could be only once if we are talking about just blasting to break some rocks, or could be continuous. For instance, if there is need to break the rock in different parts to build the canals, that could take longer. Sporadic could be that, well, it's just occasional from time to time. Magnitude refers to what is the uh, degree of disturbance or impairment to the functions and processes in ecosystems or human society. Mm? Uh, So we have all human and natural systems have the capacity to recover from impacts. So that's called resilience. But if those impacts are very frequent, take a long time, then the capacity of the environment diminishes, and it might be the case that it doesn't recover. It might be that some of the functions or processes that this particular system requires might be changed, and the degree to that to which that change occurs is called the magnitude. So if we have almost no change to a particular function or process, the magnitude is null or very low. For instance, I will take the example of birds that are nesting close to the area where we are going to build a small hydropower development. Birds, especially when they are mating or breeding, uh, are very sensitive to noise and disturbance. So if there is low noise, very sporadic, the effect on the reproduction might be very low or negligible. But if the noise is more frequent, uh, is more intense, so louder, it might disturb those individuals that are more sensitive. And then they might not be able to reproduce. And this might result in, for instance, more juveniles being recruited for the next generation. However, if we are like creating lots of noise, disturbing the vegetation, people are walking there, then all the birds might opt to give up that reproductive year and then just move away. In that case, there would be a permanent change on that particular process, so the birds would not be able to reproduce at all. Something similar might happen with fish, not depending on the timing and change to environmental flows or the characteristics of the river morphology that are important for fish laying of eggs. So all these criteria are combined to determine then how significant the impact is going to be. And it's important to specify how confident we are on the determination of those impacts. And that might come from, for example, the quality of data that we use, the amount of time that we had to do field work, the errors on the methods that we used. So we need to reflect on those limitations that we have for assessing the impacts, for quantifying them, to try to estimate the error that might be attached to our conclusions. So in summary, so determining significance is a combination of the sensitivity of importance of that part of the environment that is experiencing the impact or the benefit, the combination of these characteristics of the impacts, and then the acceptability of that particular society to the impacts that will happen. So all that needs to be considered for determining the significance. And this might be kind of the most crucial and difficult part of the assessment, because at the end is what will determine whether the project is accepted or not, but also is what will decide what society is going to get from that project. Will it be really be benefited or not? So it's very important to be transparent on all the methods and assumptions that one is using as a practitioner to then um, estimate the significance of the impacts and communicate it to all those that are interested in the project. There are some methods that are try to quantify the impacts, but of course this is also kind of relative. And I present here just this example of the rapid impact assessment matrix, because there are similar approaches that are used um, by different consulting companies or in different countries to try to quantify, give a numeric value to the impact that will happen. As you see, this method also uses some of the criteria that I presented before: the scope or geographical extent, the magnitude, the duration, the reversibility, and it creates a scale. But as I say, scales are usually arbitrary, so they are not universal value that is accepted. So this method will assign a numerical value to each one of these criteria and then combine them using a formula to obtain an environmental score. So the geographical extent is multiplied by the magnitude and direction. Here they are combining two of the criteria, the magnitude and direction. And then they are multiplying that by the addition of the duration, the reversibility, and the potential of that impact to create cumulative effects. This is the table that the original authors have with the values that they estimate. So depending on how to judge the impact, you will assess the value, and then you will apply it to the formula. Once you obtain the environmental score, you check the table. That again comes to a kind of qualitative value, as you see here by the range bands. And so that's also why many practitioners opt not to calculate scores, but just to assign categories to the impacts. In this case, this method has different categories or range bands that they call, to try to specify whether the impact or the effect is a large benefit, which would be the plus E, a major positive impact or change, is neutral, the end, or is a major negative change or impact on the environment. In some cases, in some countries, the significance might be just reduced to is significant or is not significant, or might have values like low, medium, and high significance. So for that, I guess you can check the regulations in your country or what other consultants are doing. The important is to be clear on what values one is using and explain how one decided that an impact is going to be significant or not significant. But a word of caution: whenever numerical scores are calculating, it is not appropriate to try to add them to get a quantitative score for the project. That is not acceptable. And it's not acceptable because we are talking about different types of impacts, different types of components, And by trying just to add values, we are kind of putting them as equals. And as I mentioned before, all the components are different and they have different requirements. So we cannot also compensate positive with negatives. So we cannot say this project, had X number of benefits, X number of impacts, and the net value is more benefits than impacts. So that is not correct. In impact assessment, one needs to discuss the significance of each impact individually, and then the decision has to be made based on individual impacts. So if there are 70 impacts, the decision maker needs to review which are significant and then determine which ones are acceptable or not. And at the end, decide if the project is justifiable based on the impacts and the benefits. So once we determine which impacts are significant, which have negative effects, the next step is to identify the mitigations and to decide how those negative impacts need to be managed to try to uh, avoid them or reduce them, to try to make the project more sustainable, if we use that word. This, what I show here, is called the mitigation hierarchy, and I'm just kind of putting it as an inverted pyramid uh, to mean that as much as possible, we have to opt to enhance the benefits of a project. And that might be, for instance, in trying to increase the number of people that would be benefited by a small hydropower project, uh, then try to avoid those impacts, for instance, avoiding areas that are sensitive or changing the timing to not affect certain components of the environment, also to respect the cultural values of, of the area where the project will happen, ask for permission, and in some cases where there are indigenous people, and the way to mitigate impacts might involve conducting ceremonies based on their traditions, so that needs to be part of the mitigations. Whenever it's not possible to avoid an impact, we need to aim to reduce it, and only when we cannot do that, we need to repair it. For instance, if there is need to disturb a larger area than the project footprint, then important would be to repair that area that later after the construction will not be used for the project, so it can come back to its natural state. Compensation and offset are similar, but are not the same. Compensate is somehow to do something in retribution for the damage that is occurring. You know, in this case could be, for example, if there is land that will be used for the project and is not public land, then the owner of the land needs to be compensated by by paying him or her the value of the land, but also an estimated amount for whatever this person could get from the land within a reasonable number of years, because it's losing that current and future income. But compensating is, again, not the best way. Compensating with money, in that case, is, for instance, suggested by the World Bank guidelines to try to replace whatever is lost with something with similar value. Yeah, and to sustain people while, for instance, the land becomes productive again. Whenever it's not possible to mitigate the impacts in the location, then we are talking about offsetting. And that is also the last resort. For instance, if we have a project that is going to affect some wetlands and that cannot be avoided, there are some countries that have legislation to protect wetlands, and one option could be to help restore wetlands in other areas of the river system, or even to build new wetlands. There are different mitigations that are applied for projects. And for that, uh, I include one article on the materials that you can check. And this article highlights some of the mitigations that are common, especially for waterways, for small hydropower projects. But I mentioned sometimes the mitigations might be similar to the alternatives in the way that we need to think how can we uh, avoid impacts. For instance, if we change part of the layout of the project, how can we reduce impact, for example, by including ways where fish can freely move in the water, or wildlife also, and people. Mm? How can we reduce the impact, for example, to trying to uh, disturb only the area of land that is absolutely required and not expanding construction works to other areas to not affect um, a larger area than needed. Uh, for some species, offsetting or compensation might be to create new habitat where those species could move. In the case of plants, for instance, some endemic plants or rare plants, sometimes are relocated to other areas, but that might be not always very successful. But as always, the best thing is to try to enhance the benefits of the project. And here I also want to give another warning sign that when we are designing mitigations, we need to be sure that whatever mitigation that we are proposing will not have additional impacts itself. So if we have a mitigation that might have additional impacts, we need to assess those impacts and maybe compensate them. So the best is to choose a mitigation that really controls the impact and doesn't generate other more. For instance, if we have a project and someone like we see in the picture, we're talking about an area that is uh, relatively natural. This is an area where we see some ski hills, and what you see at the bottom is the runs of the ski hills. Uh, and this is in Switzerland. Sometimes we can have wildlife, and if somebody thinks, okay, so to prevent impacts on wildlife, we are going to have uh, an electric fence around the project. Well, maybe that electric fence might have impacts because even if people could walk there and doesn't know, could touch the wires, not knowing that that is an electric fence, and could have a discharge that for some people might affect the heart. Mhm. So we always need to think. And I mentioned this case of the electric fence because that was mentioned in a project that I reviewed for a small community. Uh, so once we have drafted the mitigations, the next step is to decide what the residual effects are. So residual effects are those impacts that will result still after we apply the mitigation. So before I mentioned that the mitigations have a certain degree of effectiveness. So I mean their ability to control or reduce the impact. So we need to consider that effectiveness to then decide if the mitigation will be able to control the impact or there will be still some effect. Whatever effect will remain, and I illustrate that here by the portion of the red rectangle that remains after I place the mitigation on top, and then that is the blue rectangle that I showed there. So that residual effect is what at the end also needs to be considered for determining if the project could be acceptable or not. So the significance of the residual impacts are what influences the decision of the project, but also influences the acceptability of people. One example could be, for instance, if we have fish and we have run of the river project, but still the structure blocks the migration of fish upstream. An alternative would be to build fish passages, but fish passages are usually not very effective for fish. Only a reduced number of fish compared to the original ones that migrated managed to use these fish passages and go upstream to reproduce. So that degree to which uh, these fish passages are allowing the mitigation or say reducing the effect of the project on the mitigation, that could represent the residual impact. Once we have identified the mitigations and determined the residual effects, we need to put all together in what is called the environmental and social management plan. So this is the compilation of all the actions and procedures that the proponent need to follow and implement to control the impacts of the project. It will have a relation of all the different impacts, what are the mitigations proposed of each one, and then also who is responsible for implementing each particular mitigation, and then who is responsible for verifying that that mitigation is working. This environmental and social management plan applies to everyone that is involved in the construction and implementation of the project. And that means that even if there are third parties, contractors that are hired by the proponent, they need to be uh, knowledgeable of all these management plans because they have a responsibility to implement whatever corresponds to them. Uh, it's important to show these roles and responsibilities, but also the time in which each mitigation needs to be applied or be effective for, for how long it needs to be observed, whether that could be during the construction or during the operation. It also should have attached a monitoring plan. So how often it will verify that this mitigation is working, or if there is need to collect some data, for instance, to monitor fish, how they are moving on the river, how often those fish surveys need to happen, and also involves how the results would be communicated to the proponent, to the communities that are interested in the results, to the authorities. And yes, in some cases, the proponent might draft the social, environmental and social management plan. In some cases, the authority might modify it. And there are some cases where also the authority might have specific requirements for the projects. So whatever the authority decides at the end is what needs to be included in the final environmental and social management plan. So there are different ways to present it. Sometimes the, uh, the management plan comes in the form of a table, and sometimes it might be a series of extensive documents that specifies the mitigations and procedures for controlling the impacts on different components. For instance, a social management plan, a biodiversity management plan, and vegetation management plan. So all depends on the complexity of the project. The requirements, I say, vary, but at least the minimum requirements, I repeat again, is to specify what is the particular impact that a mitigation is going to address, then specify the mitigation, indicate what are the indicators to monitor the effectiveness of that mitigation, who is responsible, and how often needs to be monitored and then evaluated. So when we have this environmental and social management plan, then we need to put all together in the report. And for that, we need to be sure that we are considering who is going to read this report. So in principle, it will be the authorities, but also we need to consider that the report needs to be understandable for everyone that would like to read it. So an environmental assessment needs to have an executive summary that is like a shorter version of the assessment, but without all the technical details. So it's communicating clearly what the project is, what are the impacts that were analyzed, what the significance was, what impacts were important, what are the mitigations for those impacts. So it's important to have this executive summary because some people, even if they are experts in one area, for instance, the reviewers, they might be experts on social aspects or on biodiversity, but they might not be experts on other areas like hydrology. So they need to have also a summary that gives them the whole picture of the project and how it is performing on these different aspects, the environmental, the social, the technological, the economic. Uh, like the assessment, the projects, the impacts of the project are assessed at different phases. So also the impacts need to be specified, what impacts are only occurring during the construction, which refer to the operational phase. And remember, those later will be carried out when the project is operating. If the commission is considered, what impacts need to be considered there. Emphasize what were the limitations or uncertainties that the practitioner had when conducting this assessment and how they could have affected uh, the conclusion that was achieved at the end and whether an impact was significant or not. If there were alternatives, compare also, it needs to be clear uh, how these alternatives were compared based on which criteria or indicators or impacts, and then how it was decided that one alternative was the best one. So once the report is sent to the authorities will organize the revision of this report to decide whether the project will be approved or not, and it will depend on the regulations who is involved in this decision. Sometimes could be the authorities, someone working for the corresponding ministries. In some cases, the authorities might call experts to help review specific parts. For large projects, sometimes calls could be made for consultants to review a large and complex project. Depending on the size of the project, uh, uh, that would determine the number of reviewers that are needed. So the revision needs to focus on the quality of the information that is presented, how adequately the assessment covered the terms of reference that were given at the beginning, and also how it considered the participation of public or the consultation of public for assessing the impact. And in general, what is also the kind of validity of all the different methods and tools that were used for the assessment. So what is the scientific validity of the methods that were used to conclude on the significance of the impacts? And finally, well, also what are the impacts and what are the benefits of the project? So whenever the project is finally approved or not, well, if it is approved, and the next step and final step is the implementation and follow-up. So that also relates to what I mentioned in the first presentation, that impact assessment is a tool that gives information for all the life of the project. In this case, those mitigations that were included in the environmental and social management plan will be implemented at different phases, some during construction, some during operation. And someone needs to be verified that those mitigations are working as they were. If they are not, and that's one of the purposes of this follow-up, then adjustments are needed to make them happen. Uh, so the follow-up is to confirm that the mitigations are implemented, that all other conditions that were given for the approval are met satisfactorily, but also in some cases to identify other impacts that might not uh, have been identified during the assessment but might have occurred later. And it, that is something that might happen. And in that case, if new impacts come, they need to be analyzed and new mitigations need to be added to the management plan to address those particular impacts. So follow-up is not just monitoring, because monitoring is just gathering information according to a specific protocol or plan. So follow-up is to take this management plan to help assess the performance of the project, environmentally, socially, economically, uh, based on how well the impacts are mitigated. And the follow-up will bring other tools that relate to environmental management. For example, the proponent needs to implement some environmental and social management systems to ensure that it covers all the different aspects of the project that might interact with the natural or social environment. And there will be inspections made by the authority. The proponent needs to report periodically. There will be, in some cases, also social and environmental auditing. And in this case, I presented also in the first slide some of the protocols or assessment tools for hydropower projects. That would be, for instance, one role that they fulfill to contribute to evaluate the social performance of the project, not only the environmental one. In some cases, some communities might be involved in the monitoring, and that could be something that also will create better relationships within the project owners and the communities. And in some cases, the communities might be also the main proponents of the project. And then follow-up needs to go through all the life of the project, from the construction to the operation and the commission. Yeah. So in all this, the authorities are responsible for verifying that the proponent is doing what he or she has to do, but the proponent is the one that is responsible for implementing all these mitigations in the management plan. Of course, he can hire other people to do part of the work, but at the end, he is the responsible. So this implementation and follow-up is the last step in the assessment process, but also is the one that is often not uh, implemented very well, if I come to that term, because especially in developing countries, the environmental agencies don't have all the personnel that would be required, and sometimes not even the resources to do the inspections or to process the reports that the proponents are given. But not having follow-up is what at the end contributes to the degradation of the environment, because sometimes some mitigations might not be implemented, and then the findings of the assessment are not making a difference on real life. So to summarize these three presentations, I just want to mention that, yeah, we know that In general, small hydropower has much more benefits than impacts when we compare it to the large hydropower developments, especially those that require building a reservoir. But still, they have some impacts that need to be assessed and mitigated. And some of these impacts are not very evident when we are assessing a project individually, but come uh, to the light when we are adding more development in a single river system. That is what contributes to cumulative effects that on the long term will make this general hydropower development not sustainable. And one tool that is not used very well but could be used better is to use the strategic environmental assessment and the level of river basins to determine how many of these developments are appropriate, in which locations they are more appropriate. And this is to define cumulative effects. So in this presentation, I did not cover that point because of time, but I really invite you to explore more this part of how strategic environmental assessment can be used to ensure that small hydropower development is really sustainable at the level of river basins. And with that, I conclude this presentation. And I just want to communicate that in the extra slides, there is a small activity that I would like you to do before we have the live session. And also during the live session, we will have an article to read as case study to continue our discussion of the impacts and benefits of small hydropower development. So the information is on the corresponding tab in eCampus. So I invite you to review it, and I'm looking forward to see you in the live session. Have a great day, and see you soon.